These days, MMA is almost becoming its own martial art, the ultimate fighting system. But it's important to remember what came before, and for this video, we're going to showcase some prime examples of traditional martial arts techniques still being used in the world of MMA. Japanese Jiu-Jitsu Kimura. The Kimura is among the most popular arm locks found in mixed martial arts. Though you don't see it quite as much these days as you did during the earlier years of MMA, it remains a staple of any good submission fighter's arsenal. Named after the Japanese jiu-jitsu fighter Masahiko Kimura, who used it to beat the legend Helio Gracie in 1951, the Kimura is more of a strength-based submission than a lot of joint locks. But that doesn't mean it's all brute force. And the most famous example of a Kimura being used in the UFC was the absolutely insane finishing sequence that saw Frank Mir recover from the brink of defeat and somehow break the arm of the legendary Minotauro Nogueira with a Kimura. Most guys tap before the lock gets this heavy on the arm, but if you decide not to submit, a Kimura is designed to mess you up. Karate Crane Kick. We got to karate next, and one of the most famous KOs in the history of the UFC. And it's fitting that this finish came from the sport's most devoted practitioner of karate, the former 205-pound champion Lyoto Machida. By the time the Dragon stepped in there with Randy Couture, we all knew exactly how dangerous and unorthodox a striker he was. But in there with Couture, Lyoto just showed himself to be on a totally different level. The crane kick isn't often employed in MMA, but if you get your opponent fixated on your back leg like Machida did here with Randy, hopping into a front kick with your lead leg is an almost perfect misdirection. And with a master striker on one side and a more one-dimensional stand-up artist in Couture on the other, it really was a match made in heaven. Capoeira, Meia Lupa de Compasso. Capoeira as a fighting system doesn't really have too many true representatives in mixed martial arts. Sure, a lot of guys like to augment their striking with the pivots and spins of capoeira. Hell, even Conor McGregor has done so. But true capoeira specialists are hard to come by. One of the most notable examples was the lightweight Marcus Aurelio, a veteran of Pride in the UFC who managed to use his capoeira mastery, and specifically the Meia Lua de Compasso, to score one of the most amazing finishes you will ever see. The spins of capoeira, of course, create momentum for the eventual kick, but there's also a great way to confuse and distract your target, making it difficult to get their defenses in order. And that's exactly what you see playing out here, a truly artful finish. Wrestling suplex. Wrestling is as old as any fighting system, with its many branches dating back as far as 708 BC. And while narrowing the use of suplexes down to one wrestling discipline would be difficult, whether you're looking at folk style, Greco-Roman, or any other exact form, throwing someone into the air and slamming them back down again is part and parcel of the wrestling experience. In recent memory, the single finest example of a suplex of sheer power in MMA came when the late Kevin Randleman almost destroyed Fedor Emelianenko's entire career with a suplex that 999 out of 1,000 would not have gotten up from. Somehow, despite being slammed directly down on his head and neck, Fedor pretty quickly turned his luck around and eventually submitted Randleman shortly after. A suplex that good deserved the KO, but hey, that's why Emelianenko was the greatest. Judo, various hip throws. Judo's such a useful fighting system, and its entire philosophy made it a perfect fit for mixed martial arts. Sure, you definitely need other skills beyond judo to be fully competitive, but if you can get your opponent to the ground using one of the many trips and throws that make up this martial art, you're already going to be shortening your odds. And while Ronda Rousey's most certainly the most famous judoka to ever compete in MMA, if you're looking for the most eye-catching example of high-level judo in this sport, you gotta take some time and check out Karo Parisian's highlight reel. Instead of narrowing it down to one particular technique, we might as well take a moment to celebrate just how easily Parisian was able to dominate from the clinch position against most fighters. He had such a superior knowledge of judo to his opponents that he was able to make great fighters, great grapplers even, fly through the air like they weighed nothing at all. His fight with Diego Sanchez is one of the wildest MMA grappling bouts you will ever see. Muay Thai, Muay Baran Flying Knee. Muay Baran and Muay Thai are two strands of the same fighting philosophy, and in many ways these days you have to have Muay Thai coaching in order to deal with many of the techniques that are commonplace in the sport. They don't call it the art of 8 limbs for nothing. Punches and kicks are expected, but when knees and elbows start flying, you gotta know what you're doing, especially in the clinch, where MMA differs to boxing in terms of referee intervention. But out of all the techniques borrowed from Thai martial arts, their use of the flying knee in particular has given MMA perhaps its most effective knockout tool. The flying knee doesn't always land, but if it does, even partially, this high-risk, high-reward move can leave your opponent out cold in a split second. Jorge Masvidal's flying knee knockout of Ben Askren will be forever immortalized as one of the most jaw-dropping and fastest finishes in MMA. And who can forget Michael Venom Page's well-timed counter to Evangelista Santos that caved his skull in and writhing on the ground in agony. But for every success story like MVP versus Santos, you're also likely to end up with a situation like what happened to Andrei Arlovsky when he rushed in against Fedor Emelianenko. Like we said, high risk, high reward. Jeet Kune Do, Wing Chun, close quarter striking defense parrying. Jeet Kune Do and Wing Chun are two fighting systems that fall under the branch of Chinese martial arts. And in fact, Jeet Kune Do and its creator Bruce Lee have been credited with seeing the need for a mix of martial arts decades before the UFC's creation. But are these techniques actually useful against a trained opponent? Well, sometimes. Like a lot of these older fighting styles, there are a lot of flaws to them, especially when you have a highly skilled MMA fighter in front of you. But Anderson Silva in his later years was able to adopt some of these techniques of Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do, specifically the parries of this art form. Jeet Kune Do roughly translates as the way of the intercepting fist, and in there with Michael Bisping, Silva used a system of defense that was uncannily similar to the teaching of Bruce Lee, and before him, Wing Chun as a whole. Basically, it looked like the Spider had been spending quite a lot of time with a Wing Chun dummy. Taekwondo, spinning back kick. We could have honestly spent an entire video breaking down the various Taekwondo techniques that are seen in MMA. As a fighting system on its own, there are far too many holes in Taekwondo to make it realistic as a pathway in mixed martial arts, especially these days. But tools from the Taekwondo arsenal can be very useful for any fighter to learn. And for our money, the spinning back kick is perhaps the most iconic and well-utilized example of a Taekwondo move we regularly see in MMA competition. Its finest practitioner, well, that would probably be Dennis Siver. Sure, a lot of you might know him for getting clowned by Conor McGregor, but this top 10 featherweight had a ridiculous mastery of the spinning back kick to the body, finishing several opponents with this move over the years. He was as good as his one move as any fighter has been good at one single move in UFC history. Bonus round, Kung Fu, leg sweep, and sand throw. And for a bonus round, how could we not give a mention to one of the most devoted true martial artists in the sport? Tony Ferguson has taken on elements of many different fighting systems during his career. I mean, the dude trains with a Wing Chun dummy. But one of the most famous examples of El Cucui's eccentric approach to fighting coming to the surface was in there with Justin Gaethje, a fight that saw him take an all-time great beating at the hands of the Highlight. However, despite absorbing massive punishment in that fight, Ferguson still managed to hit a Kung Fu leg sweep out of nowhere, a totally random move that you just never see in MMA. And then, for absolutely no reason, he decided to feign throwing sand in Gaethje's face. Look, he may have lost that fight badly, but there is no fighter quite like Tony Ferguson.